In Aristotle's analysis of both the formal cause and the final cause of human beings, he thinks it necessary to bring in the divine. So, with regard to the formal cause, if the formal cause of a human being is the form or shape or whatever of a human being, which we read in the De Anima, is the soul of a human being. The formal cause of the human being is the soul of the human being. In the De Anima, he then goes on to describe the various kinds of soul with a particular focus on the kind of soul that a human being has. And what he ends up revealing or arguing is that human beings have a soul that has three parts: this nutritive, perceptive, and rational part. And then in his discussion of the rational part, that's where we find him drawing in these connections to the divine. We see this explicitly in the active intellect, but there are also indications of this with regard to his discussion of the passive intellect. But more generally, the idea seems to be that the intellect is a divine part of us, or at the very least, it resembles the divine. It resembles God. And we find this very same idea, though not so explicitly stated, in the Nicomachean Ethics in Book 10. There he argues that wisdom is the best virtue because it's the virtue of the best part of us. And wisdom, of course, is the virtue of our rational soul, of the rational part of our soul. It's the virtue of our intellect. Why is that the best part of us? Well, pretty clearly, what Aristotle thinks is that the intellect or rational part of us is the best part of us because that's the divine part of us. That's the part that we share in common with God. God does not have a perceptive soul. God does not have a nutritive soul because God doesn't have a body. And as we saw in the De Anima, in order to perceive, in order to have emotions, and in order to grow and digest food, you need a body. Those powers are nothing other than certain organizations of bodily parts. And since God doesn't have a body, God's not going to have those kinds of souls. So God just has a rational soul. And so the rational part of our souls is the divine part of us. It's what's most similar to God. That's Aristotle's idea. And then we saw, so that's all with regard to the formal cause of human beings, the soul of human beings. Aristotle thinks in order to fully understand the formal cause of a human being, you need to understand how it's related to the divine. With regard to the final cause, what we saw in the Nicomachean Ethics is that for the sake of which human beings develop and grow as they do, and that for the sake of which they should do all that they do, is ultimately contemplation. Aristotle doesn't think the other virtues are totally worthless. No, you ought to engage in the other virtues when the time is appropriate to, right? You ought to be just and temperate and so on when that is what the occasion calls for. But insofar as we can, we ought to strive to cultivate our minds. We ought to devote ourselves to truth, to wisdom, to the contemplative life. That's Aristotle's argument in Book 10, because that's really what the perfection of our human nature consists in. That's really the final cause of human beings. That's the good that human beings can achieve in their lives. That is that for the sake of which, for human beings. That is the purpose, and another way to put it, that is the purpose of human beings, is to live a life like that, a contemplative, virtuous life. And so then what we saw, and we're going to see this also here in book 12 of the Metaphysics, is that Aristotle thinks God lives a contemplative life, that the contemplative life is a divine life. And so, insofar as we live a contemplative life, we are becoming more godlike. And it is our end or purpose in life, according to Aristotle, to become as godlike as possible. That's what he means that's what he's saying. That's what he's implying when he says we ought to contemplate as much as we can. Right. So our final cause essentially is to become as godlike as we can. And so both with respect to the final cause and to the formal cause, uh, Aristotle thinks we need to bring in the divine in order to make sense of these things, right? Both the formal and final cause of human beings. And so what we're going to do now is look directly at Aristotle's views about God, about the divine. That's what occurs in the second half of Book 12 of the Metaphysics. This is his account of divinity, of God. And that's what we're going to close out our unit on Aristotle with. Now, he begins in Book 12, Chapter 6, by giving something of an argument for the existence of God. He is going to argue that God is the first efficient cause. Again, he doesn't use that terminology. The terminology of efficient cause is a kind of later addition to the tradition. Aristotle refers to the efficient cause as the source of movement or the moving cause. And so, what we're going to ultimately see Aristotle argue is that there has to be a first moving cause, as he calls it, an unmoved mover. So, what is the idea? How does this work? I'm going to introduce a bit of terminology that Aristotle himself doesn't use, but I think people later in the tradition following on Aristotle, developing these very same ideas, do use it. And I think it's helpful for our purposes to understand what Aristotle is saying here. The idea is something like this. The world is populated by contingent things. So let's take an example, a house. A house is a contingent thing. What does that mean? That means it exists. Let's say this is an actually existing house, right? It exists, but it doesn't have to exist. It's possible for it not to exist. It exists contingently. It actually exists. Sure, fine, it's there right now, but it doesn't have to be. It exists contingently. It could have been the case that the builders, on the day that they were going to build the house, it could have happened that, whatever, they got sick or there was an earthquake or whatever, right? And they just never got around to building the house. And so the house never came into existence in the first place. That could happen. That's possible. And so, yeah, the house does in fact exist now, but it might not have, right? The builders might have decided, no, we're not going to build that one. Or, right, the house exists right now, but, a meteor might fall on it from space and now it doesn't exist. The house exists contingently. Now, what Aristotle is going to be really focused on here in Book 12, Chapter 6, is that first way in which it exists contingently. It actually exists now, but it didn't have to. The builders might not have built it, right? It actually exists now, but it didn't have to. Something brought it into being. For any contingently existing thing, there has to be then some cause of its actually existing because it didn't have to. Right? It might not have. The builders might not have shown up. And so there has to be some cause of the houses actually being there, right? The way Aristotle thinks about this is in terms of potentiality and actuality. So let's consider this house before it was built, when it was a merely potential house, right? That's a potential house right there. It's just a pile, right? It's all the materials for a house. It's what Aristotle calls the matter of a house, right? And the matter of a house is not, the primary elements like carbon and hydrogen or whatever, or in Aristotle's view, fire, earth, air, and water. That's too far removed. That's not ready to accept the form of house. The matter for a house, it would be things like floor joists and nails and windows and drywall and so on, right? The stuff you see there. That's the matter for a house. That's what's potentially a house. That is, as I described it earlier, right on the verge of becoming a house. All it needs is someone to impart the form of house into it, and then it will be a house. And so the way contingently existing things work is that initially They don't actually exist. In this state, we don't actually have a house. We have something that's potentially a house, not actually a house. And it becomes an actual house. It comes to actually exist through the imposition of form, through some cause, right? There has to be some cause that turns this potential house into an actual house. And obviously, that's a builder, right? So you need to bring a builder to that house. And the way Aristotle conceives of what the builder is doing, the builder imparts the form, the shape or plan of the house into the matter, right? That's what, in general, efficient causes do. They impart form into matter. And so the efficient cause of the house is the builder. Really, Aristotle thinks the efficient cause of the house is kind of something like the form of the house in the builder's mind. What the builder does, the builder himself is something of just an instrument for the form. The form is translated from the builder's mind through the builder's actions into the matter, into the bricks and nails and boards and so on. And then what you get at the end of that process is an actually existing house, right? So for any contingently existing thing, there's going to be some sort of analogous process. And the analogous process is going to be that the contingently existing thing, the thing that actually exists right now, that's actually a house or whatever, right? Initially was only potentially what it actually now is. And that there had to be some cause that made it actually exist. And so in the case of the house, that's the builder. But what Aristotle now notes is that we can ask the same thing about the builder himself, because every contingently existing thing requires some cause of its actually existing, because it's possible for them not to exist. There has to be something that actualized that potential, that turned it into an actually existing thing. And what he's going to emphasize is the cause must be actual. Now, that takes a bit of unpacking. The builder in this case actually has the form. The form is actual in his mind. Recall Aristotle's ideas from the De Anima about how the intellect works. The intellect receives the forms of things, and then the forms of things actually exist in the intellect. And so the form of the house actually exists in the builder's house, in the builder's mind. And it's only because that form is actually there that the builder then can produce an actually existing house. It's simply, right, the production of a house is simply a matter of transferring that actually existing form into the matter, right? And so the cause must have must be in actuality, is the way that Aristotle thinks about it. Okay. But as I'd mentioned earlier, right, the builder himself is a contingently existing thing, right? The builder might not have existed. And you can think of that in both ways. You can think of that because, whatever, a meteor might fall on him and now he doesn't actually exist. You just have a pile of human parts or whatever. Not to be too gruesome about it, but, or, right, his, and again, not to get too graphic about it, but, however, I don't know, he looks to be what, I don't know, 35 and 35 years ago or so, 36 years ago, his parents might not, had that extra glass of wine. And so he might not be around, right? That could have happened. He might have never come into existence. Nothing. And so the way Aristotle thinks about reproduction is it's a matter of, again, similarly, actualizing a potential. It's a little bit different because it's not as though parents just take a bunch of fully mature body parts and put them together or something like that. And so Aristotle has a kind of complicated analysis of how exactly reproduction works, how exactly reproduction functions as an efficient cause. We're not going to worry about it. But the analysis is going to follow a similar structure. The builder himself didn't have to exist. He was initially a kind of potential that was then actualized. Aristotle actually indicates how some of this works. He thinks of menstrual fluid as a kind of potentially existing human being, which is then actualized by sperm. It's weird, but that's how he does it. And so there is something that actualized that potential. That's true of every contingently existing thing. It's true of the builder. But then that cause must be first actual, but then, is it contingent? Well, I don't know. If the cause is really just the builder's parents, which is kind of how Aristotle thinks about it, that's what actualized that potential. Well, his parents, are contingently existing things. And so we would then have to ask, well, why do they exist? And so on and so on and so on. But what Aristotle notes is that these kinds of causes, these kinds of chains, can't go on to infinity. You can't have an infinite chain of causes, because then nothing would ever actually be actualized. Another way to think about it, right? Because in order to actualize something, you have to actually have the form. And the builder is able to actually acquire the form only because he's been actualized. There has to be some original source of actuality that doesn't itself need to be actualized. Otherwise, there would be no source of actuality. Nothing would be actual. Another way that Aristotle thinks about it is in terms of motion. If a billiard ball moves across the table, it's in motion, it's been moved. And that billiard ball might move something else, right? It might hit another ball and then move the other ball, right? So the cue ball, it's in motion, it hits the 8 ball and causes the 8 ball to move. Aristotle would say the cue ball in this case is a moved mover. It moves the 8 ball. That's the sense in which it's a mover, but it's moved by the cue, right? It's a moved mover. Things that are in motion need to be moved by something else. And the reason that the cue ball is able, put it this way, the reason that the cue ball is able to impart motion to the 8 ball is because it itself is moved. It's simply translating that motion, right? It's transferring that motion. Aristotle is, and then why is the cue ball moving? Well, because the cue moved. Well, why is the cue moving? Well, because your hand moved, and blah, 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 and so on, right? What we have in this case, in this chain, is simply a transfer of motion. Aristotle is going to make a very similar point here. That transfer of motion can't go back infinitely. Otherwise, you would have no motion to transfer. There has to be some source of that motion that is not itself in motion. Just like there has to be some source of actuality that itself has no potential. Another way of putting the point, there must be some actually existing thing that is not itself contingent, that doesn't require actualization from something else. There must be some original source of actuality that has no potential. That's Aristotle's idea, because if it had potential, it would need to be actualized by something else. And then we just keep going, but that's impossible. We can't go on forever. Otherwise, nothing would ever actually be actualized. But things are actualized out there in the world. And so there has to be some source of actuality that doesn't have any potentiality at all, and so doesn't require any kind of actualization from an outside source. Because if it had some potential, it would require actualization from an outside source. In other words, there must be some source of actuality of all things that sets all things in motion, which is pure actuality and has no potentiality in it. Because if it had potentiality, it might stop, or it might never have started. There'd have to be some reason why it doesn't stop, some reason why it started, and that reason would have to be some further actual thing. And then you'd be off on this infinite regress, which is impossible, because if there were an infinite regress, nothing would ever actually happen. Nothing would ever actually be actualized. And so there has to be something that exists not contingently, which has no potential, which is just to say that it's pure actuality. But being pure actuality and having no potential, right? It's not in potency, it's purely actual. It must not have any matter. Because if it had matter, here's one way to think about it. If it had matter, if it was material, it could be destroyed. You can destroy material things by messing up the matter. And so it could stop. But by definition, this pure actuality can't stop. It's pure actuality. It's not contingent. But also, another way of thinking about this point, it must not have any matter. Well, because matter is identified with potentiality, right? Matter is potential for something. It's what's receptive of form. But not having any potentiality, this actually existing thing that is pure actuality and not contingent, must not have any matter. Another way to think about it, a third way, right? If it had matter, that matter would need actualization, right? A house has matter. That matter needed actualization from the builder. If this source of actuality had matter, its matter would need actualization from an outside source. But the way we're thinking about this, by definition, it's not going to need actualization from an outside source, and so it doesn't have any matter. But not having matter, not having any potential, this thing must be eternal. Which is to say, it never came into existence and it cannot go out of existence. Why could it not have come into existence? Recall Aristotle's hylomorphism, which contains his account of coming into being. Things come into being, or put it this way, Aristotle's analysis of coming into being crucially involves both matter and form. Matter then understood as both privation and underlying thing. In order for something to come into being, there must be some underlying matter. And a thing comes into being when it loses its privation and adopts the form, or comes to receive the form. When some matter loses privation and acquires a form. That's what coming into existence is. That's what coming into being is. If this thing that is pure actuality, doesn't have any matter, well, then it couldn't have possibly come into being. Right? Coming into a being is I don't want to use the word matter again. It's a matter of matter acquiring a form and losing a privation. This pure actuality doesn't have matter, and so couldn't have acquired a form and lost a privation, which is just to say it couldn't have come into being. It must have always existed. But moreover, it can't go out of being, because going out of being, Aristotle would analyze in a similar fashion as coming into being. What is it for a human to go out of being? It's for the human body to lose the form of human being. That's what death is. And so what's left behind after you die is really just an assemblage of body parts, a corpse, which has lost the form. The matter has lost the form. That's how things are destroyed or corrupted or go out of being. It's by losing. It's through the matter losing the form. But again, because this non-contingently existing pure actuality doesn't have any matter, it's impossible for it to go out of being, right? Because there's no matter there which could possibly lose form. And so this non-contingently existing pure actuality, which is immaterial, must also be eternal, must exist always, both backwards and forwards. It's always existed and will always exist. Aristotle calls this thing the unmoved mover. It moves other things without itself being moved. It actualizes other things without itself being actualized by something else. That's Aristotle's idea. And Aristotle says the unmoved mover, that is God. In subsequent videos, we're going to see why exactly he might identify this thing, this unmoved mover, with God, and also how this unmoved mover moves other things, because at this point, that's a bit of a mystery. How could something move something else without itself moving, right? If I wanted to move the cue, I myself have to move. How could you have something that puts other things into motion without itself moving? That seems somewhat mysterious. Aristotle's going to address this in book 12, chapters 7 and 8.